we all recognize that a crucial aspect of democracy, of our republic, is that voters get to decide who will govern. Elected representatives remain responsible to the voters who elected them. An obligation outlined clearly in the policy platform that's created by the party. So and they're not bound to it, but history shows that the parties pretty much do stick to it because it is a statement of priorities and principles. And it offers a distinct choice between voters. When you compare the platforms between the two parties, increasingly there are stark contrasts. But how do these platforms influence the voting patterns of elected officials? How important are they? Well, joining me now to discuss this, Dr. Lee Payne, professor of political science at Stephen F. Austin State University, who has written and researched extensively on political party platforms and their effect. Lee, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me back.
So let's begin with an overview of your research and how you used content analysis to identify future policies based upon each party's platform.
Yeah, it started with my dissertation, and originally I just did 1980 through 2004. Then I expanded on that to 2008 for the paper that was published. But I expanded on Pomper and Lederman's research, where they looked at party platforms from 44 to 76. And the reason I wanted to take this up with my dissertation is because of the fact of polarization increasing between the parties. And my hypothesis all along was, with polarization increasing, the platforms would take more different stances on their policies to give people a clearer picture of what they stand for.
And is that not what has happened?
It is what has happened.
I mean, increasingly, we're seeing the divide between the two parties and those party platforms. I mean, 2016, the last time, prior to COVID, where the parties actually met as normal and crafted party platforms, clear contrast on key issues. But having that statement of policy priorities, what difference does it make? Does it have an effect? Did you find out does that actually affect the parties?
Yeah, so when I had to replicate Pomper and Lederman's research, and they wanted to look at what kind of promises were rational and which ones were irrational. And so it was pretty arduous. I had to read all the party platforms, look at the future promises that they made, and then categorize them and find out which ones were rational, which ones were irrational. And for both parties, they were very rational in their statements.
And what was what did you find out when it came to, you talked about future promises? What percentage of those, if you categorized them that way, were actually followed through and actually became policy?
Well, that's part of what I didn't get to in my paper, but I did in my dissertation. And so when I wrote the paper, obviously, my dissertation was over 200 pages long, and you've got to cut this stuff down for a journal article. And I found that 82.2% of the votes cast on legislation that parties took stands on were in accord with the promises made. But there was a difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, where Republicans kept 85% of their promises and Democrats only kept 67.9% of their promises.
So I mean, that's quite significant. So these party platforms are not just these rhetorical expressions, but they are roadmaps for the future when you look to policy down the road. If we're talking about, if I heard you right, 80 up to 85% of the Republicans kept what they
87.5 for Republicans, and where was it? 69.7% for Democrats.
Well, I actually would prefer that the Democrats not keep their promises based upon their platform. But, I mean, that's quite significant. So if something is in a Republican Party platform, 87% of the time that actually becomes policy, that's quite significant.
Yeah. So this part, like I said, it was left out of the paper that got so much attention back in 2016. I had to run a series of crosstabs and logit regressions to get all this. So I had to look at all the votes cast, and that's where I used the Poole and Rosenthal data, all the roll call votes cast that were in line with the party promises, and run a series of logits where I had party ID and then the ADA score for ideology. And then I looked at, also added in using American National Election Studies data, surveys done every 2 years during election years. I looked at the percent of the population that favored one policy over the other. And that's where I came up with the high number of platform promises kept that both parties tried to. But again, Republicans were substantially higher with 87.5 compared to 67.9.
Pretty significant difference there. All right, Dr. Payne, we're up against a break, so I'm going to ask you to hold on. We're going to come back. I want to finish this conversation because I want to talk a little bit more about that history and that divide as the parties became more polarized, and what issues may have been reflected in that in those party platforms. All right, I'm continuing my conversation on political party platforms with Dr. Lee Payne, professor of political science at Stephen F. Austin State University. Lee, again, thanks for sticking around. So I'm going to go back.
Sure.
You said as the parties became more polarized, you saw that reflected in the party platforms in terms of the polarization, the diametrically opposed policies. Talk a little bit about that, and were there particular issues that really jumped out leading the way in that stark contrast?
Yeah, so I like I said, I have kept up with the polarization scores using Americans for Democratic Action ADA scores from the 97th through the 116th. So I have 1981 through 2020 on that. And for example, back in the 97th Congress, there was only a 43.5% divide between the Republicans and Democrats in the House, and a 46% divide between the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. With the polarization, we hit a high in the House. So remember, we're going back to 1981, 43.5 in the House. And in the 114th Congress, it was 85.5. So almost double.
Wow.
And then in the Senate for the 116th Congress, it was 87.7. So both parties are reverting to their ideological spectrums. But as I tell my students when we're going over this in class, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the example I use is if Coke and Pepsi tasted the same, there'd be no reason to pick one over the other. So when the parties became more polarized and their platforms became more divergent, it gives voters a clearer picture of what they're voting for.
Does that, let me ask you about that, Lee. Does that prompt people to be more engaged because the choice is clear and they don't have to think through it as much? They can see very clearly that these two parties, this one's over here, this one's over here. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, party ID, there's something called a heuristic, which is an intellectual shortcut that most people use to vote. And party ID is the number one heuristic that people use. So now there's still mistakes made because, as you know, Republicans are considered the pro-life party, Democrats the pro-choice party, and there are, pro-life, pro-choice Republicans who people may vote for using the heuristic.
Right.
If they don't do their research into the candidates. and find out exactly what the candidate stands for, because they can diverge from the party platform, as we know.
So
this isn't like England where they vote for a party.
Right.
We vote for candidates with a party ID.
Right. But if you don't have time to vet the candidates, your fallback is to which party do they align with. So with that in mind, how important is it that the parties keep those strong platforms that speak to those issues that provide them a distinctive?
I think it's very important. People need to know what they're getting when they vote for a certain candidate, depending on the party ID of the candidate. And again, with the research I did, in the polarization that's taken place, there is a huge difference between the parties now and what the platforms stand for. Now, they tend to change with time. For instance, Democrats usually had defense at the back of their platform, but after 9/11, when the 2004 Democrat platform came out, they moved defense to the front. So sometimes it's issue specific.
Let me talk about, we just got a couple minutes left, but you mentioned the life issue. What are some of the other issues that are really, as you see it over time? I mean, I could read the two-party platforms today and I could tell you where they stand, but over time, what have become those distinguishing issues between the parties?
All right, I can answer that one from all the research I did. And I'm reading from my notes, so sorry if I'm not looking directly at you. Republican platforms pay more attention to foreign policy, economics, defense, and government pledges, while Democrat platforms pay more attention to agriculture, resources, welfare, civil rights, and labor pledges. So there is a very distinct difference between the parties.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, Dr. Payne, I want to thank you for taking time to join us. I found your research fascinating. I absolutely found it fascinating because for a long time I thought those platforms, before I got involved in going and being a part of the platform committee in probably the last 20 years, I just thought it was a big party that people have. I didn't know these actually things had impact, but I saw it with my own eyes, and then reading your research showed that in fact it does. So I appreciate you doing that, and I appreciate you coming on the program today.
Appreciate you having me.